Before I Turn has been a long-time favorite metalcore band for me. I discovered them around the release of their 2018 album Claustrophobic, and the story was one that really enticed me. It was an important record in my general obsession with concept albums, and I have played it on and off ceaselessly for years ever since then. It's kind of insane to me, the fact that it's been about 7.5 years since the album actually first came out. My, how things have changed, right? In 2020, the band followed up Claustrophobic with an album called Lovelorn, another concept album that continued the story of its predecessor. I was once again pretty obsessed with that album, and the general vibe of the two records is such that I've always considered what it would be like to produce a kind of like film for those albums, to make a full album music video, incorporating both of them. This is a thought, an idea that I had at one point during those years, and while I never really took it seriously, it is one that I have thought about off and on for ever, basically. Nothing more serious than the I wonder kinds of moments, but it was enough to daydream about. I love those albums. In 2024, Before I Turn then released The Devil Exists, which was seemingly going to be the next part of this claustrophobic storyline, but then it shifted gears and became a more general concept album in the sense that the whole thing was written around a particular set of ideas and themes, but not necessarily telling a story. But the closing track of The Devil Exists, The Tailor, was a pretty heavy tease of what would become this album in 2026, Immoral and Malevolent Happenings, to the point that part of the clip from The Tailor is in one of the songs on the album. Immoral and Malevolent Happenings is another continuation and likely the end of what we got from the claustrophobic storyline, and it completely flips that story on its head. First of all, the timeline is way different than what anybody might be expecting, and it's really awesome for that. Furthermore, it isn't just the album telling the story this time. This video is being released on both my main and my second channels because Immoral and Malevolent Happenings is not just an album, it is also a book. I did the primary editing on that book, so yes, as a disclaimer, I am somewhat biased with regards to this brief review that I'm doing for the two projects collectively, but I wanted to talk about the two of them together since they are companions to one another. The simple recommendation when it comes to Immoral and Malevolent Happenings is actually a pretty fine place to start here. In my typical book reviews on my main channel, I go through the good, the bad, the ugly. I don't do any of these in a scripted format, and then I follow that up with a recommendation. But here, I think it's important to note who a good target audience, if any, might be for Immoral and Malevolent Happenings. And that is, really, if you enjoy Sweeney Todd to any degree, either musically or in terms of the actual story and plot, there will be a lot to like about this duo package. Sonically, the album takes some inspiration from the musical, every song having a direct influence from the musical's soundtrack, and story-wise, the book takes a lot of inspiration from the plot of the musical. I think that if you enjoy Sweeney Todd, you should absolutely be checking out at least the book if you're not into metal music, but I obviously also recommend the album if you are into metal, particularly core, although core is a little bit more of a touchy subject. It's, one of those things, both inside and outside the metal scene, where it's kind of its own beast, and a lot of people like it, but a lot of people don't, and it's just a weird category of metal to be in. I love it, but that's just me. But beyond the Sweeney Todd influence, I also just think that if you are at all invested in the story of Claustrophobic and Lovelorn, if you are a fan of Before I Turn, you should be listening to the album. Obviously, you're already going to. But as far as the book is concerned, if you are invested in that story, you should still be checking out Immoral and Malevolent Happenings novel version, because I think that it actually really shifts certain key aspects of the story and makes it into something really unexpected and really interesting that I think is worth your time. Stuff that is if not explicitly explained, but at least implied in the book, that you're not fully getting from the album just on account of the limited, like word count, obviously, that an album is actually able to give you. It's not able to be as generally explicit as a book can be when explaining some things. And that's not to say that the book is going to over-explain anything. In fact, I think it does a pretty good job of not over-explaining some things. There's a little bit of a mystery to it, and that makes it worth experiencing if you're into that story. If you want to see the way that it changes things but still leaves certain aspects open to, placing them in a particular order, or, what the actual truth is behind certain questions being left up to you, I think Immoral Malevolent Happenings as a dual package actually does this quite well, enticing you from one version to the other without losing itself or over-explaining itself in either case. Like I said, if you just like that story and you're interested to see where it goes next, let's just say this album, but more especially the book, will surprise you. It is not what you think. I do think the novel deepens and accentuates the tone and the setting and the characters in the ways that you would expect a novel to do so, and the album, on the other hand, also utilizes certain motifs, not just from what it's inspired by, but also from the preceding albums in a couple of places to really expand upon that narrative oomph, the effect that that story is going to have on you. It's implicitly super impactful as a result. A little bit more on some specifics with regard to either package. I would say from a musical perspective, I love a lot of the swings that Alex has taken with melodies and choruses on the album. That's one of the things that Before I Turn has really managed to stand out with for me as far as metalcore goes, is having some surprisingly brutal moments, but some really, really soaring choruses that kind of stick out from that package in ways that like I said, I think are just really impactful. They really work. There's a lot of catchiness to be found on Immoral and Malevolent Happenings where you might not expect there to be, but there's also plenty of ways in which Alex bolsters that and compensates in the opposite direction with the same meaty types of riffs that you have come to expect from the band. While I don't think that this album is quite as genty as Lovelorn was, the production does kind of make up for that by really filling the sound in a way that is kind of new for the band in my estimation. I confess I prefer perhaps the original version of the first single, for example, over the album version, because I feel like that production is the album production is slightly too beefy for my personal tastes, but that's more of a taste thing on my part. If you're not really comparing it that much, or if you're not like me and you haven't listened to that original single 1.5 million times because it's one of your favorite Before I Turn songs now, you're probably not going to notice that difference. That's more of a nitpick on my part. Like I said, more of a taste thing. But if you like Before I Turn's style of core, there's zero reason why you won't like this album from that perspective. And I do feel like it is a culmination and yet expansion of their sound as a band overall, both at the same time. And it manages to be both of those things more naturally and fittingly than I would argue that like The Devil Exists does. The Devil Exists manages to do a similar thing, but it's also a little bit more experimental in nature with some of that, and not all of those ideas fully landed for me. Immoral and Malevolent Happenings is a bit more consistent in that regard, and manages to keep itself united amongst itself, if that makes any sense. Just in general, the sonic peculiarities that make Before I Turn who they are as an artist, particularly with regard to Alex's songwriting, they're all here in equal measures, dynamic and faithful to itself, adjusting and evolving into a future version of the band without giving up any of what has become familiar for the band at the same time. It yields something that fits brilliantly, not just with their catalog in general, but with this story specifically, this 3-album story, disregarding the other 3 releases that they've put out. In fact, I would say that the way that the record manages to be different from its predecessors, and in hindsight, the same could be said of Lovelorn, the way that these 3 albums are both very obviously the same band, but also very different albums, really actually serves the full story in a way that will make more sense if you know the story, and also if you read the book, you'll kind of figure out why certain POVs and perspectives, even amongst the album, why the differences in sonic tendencies make sense for that between the albums, even if it all is just in hindsight. Whether or not all of that was intended for the beginning is probably not always the case, given how Alex was not really influenced by Sweeney Todd so much until just a few years ago. But in either case, I do think it is super effective. They managed to take advantage of all of that stuff. Even the kind of storytelling that can only be done through music is done in its own unique way within these albums, even when compared to, say, a musical like Sweeney Todd originally was. They managed to take advantage of the musical ideas while mixing it in with a more traditional album and just making that story work in both senses. It's might sound a little confusing. I know I'm probably not making sense, but yeah, that's just how I'll put it for now. With regard to the book, a little bit more specifically from a literary perspective, I also admire what Alex was able to do as a debut author. There are going to be people who look at this book not in the context of being a fan of the band or the claustrophobic story already, and those people, if there's anybody on my main channel watching this video for that, you're probably wondering, is there any merit to reading the book on its own terms? And I would argue that yes, there is some merit in doing that. I was decently impressed with many moments throughout it while I was doing the editing. Being a big fan of the claustrophobic storyline really aids this, but I do think that people who don't really know or care much about that story inherently are necessarily going to have that much reason to dislike this. I would still argue that you should be a fan of Sweeney Todd. If you're not a fan of Sweeney Todd, or if you actively dislike it, you're probably not going to like this book because it does wear that influence on its sleeve quite heavily. In fact, I would argue a little bit overly so, perhaps. There are certainly going to be other people who think so much, but if you enjoy, understated horror within what you read, the type of horror that stays understated in basically all of the ways that it exists, except for when it gets violent, in which case it gets, perhaps a bit surprisingly so, not incredibly graphic. Alex doesn't go way too far with the violence in here, but if you like it when horror is pretty muted until it gets violent, and then it's like violent, and then it's pretty understated again once the violence is over, I think that the balance that Alex was able to strike with this actually really worked. It was really effective for the type of storytelling. It kind of serves the, mild type of shock factor that you'd expect from that sort of Sweeney Todd type of storyline, right? It's one of those things where Alex even told me at one point that he hasn't even really read very much horror, but I do think that he implicitly understands what makes violence effective in horror, but most especially in a non-visual medium, which I think also is pretty evident going all the way back to Claustrophobic, as an album. The sonic ideals and literary flair of the music and of the book, together both serve that end. I think Alex just really understood what he was doing with that. I can't say that Immoral and Malevolent Happenings is the best debut book I've ever read, nor was it even one of my favorite books that I read in 2025, which was when I edited it late last year, but I do think that it is a book that will satisfy the audience that it intends to serve, which admittedly is first and foremost that of Before I Turn's audience, those people who are already fans of the music who want to expand that experience into the multimedia that is the book. If you're just a book reader, you don't like metal music, you're not already invested in that story, I think that if you're a big fan of Sweeney Todd, you could consider checking this out. But in general, I'm not going to say that this is something that you need to drop everything and read because, well, like I said, I think it's serving its intended audience very well, but people outside of that audience, it's probably not going to really do much for in one way or the other. It might not be offensively bad, but it's also not going to be something that really clicks for you. I kind of doubt that much. But at the end of the day, what I am most looking forward to personally is really just seeing where both Before I Turn as an artist and Alex Anglis as a personal author go with the next story. Alex has told me that the next album for the band is actually more of a companion to the book that he is writing now, as opposed to the book Immoral and Malevolent Happenings being a little bit more of a companion to the similarly or identically titled album, and I'm looking forward to seeing what that ends up looking like when it comes time to actually experience those stories. And furthermore, Alex has also said that the next story, both the album and the book combined, is a completely new one and also entirely separate from Claustrophobic, so maybe there is a chance that I'll be able to recommend either one of these a little bit more heartily on their own terms, as opposed to, you know, as continuing the story of Claustrophobic like the album is. You know, I personally can't wait to experience that next story, both in its literature and musical formats. But yeah, that is what I have to say about Immoral and Malevolent Happenings. Thank you for watching this video. If you did, I know it was a little bit of a different one, both in terms of an album review on the second channel. I've not done one like this ever, and as a book review of sorts on the main channel, because again, I've also never done a book review like this before, just trying to combine those and just talk briefly about my experience with this multimedia project here. I hope you enjoyed it. But like I said, that's going to be the end of this video. Thank you guys for watching. I really appreciate it. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next one.